Okay. Well, hopefully we'll have the Sunday school lesson back up next week. John 15:13. If you're in any kind of relationship, you better know the answer to this question. What is tomorrow? I heard somebody whisper it. It's okay. You can speak out loud. It's okay. It is Valentine's Day. And so I'm trying to bring a message, and I kind of got a shock this morning. I thought that I had the message all printed up, and I didn't. And so I thought, oh boy. So if you looked at my notes, they're marker and they're just kind of written out. So let's hope that the Lord does something with me that works out better than what our Sunday school lesson did in that. John chapter 15, verse 13. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. Would you be willing to lay down your life for your friends? I kind of ask myself a lot of questions as I look at these notes. It's interesting, too, what we consider our friends. I told a guy a couple weeks ago he was almost on my best friend list. That's an interesting statement. But it hasn't been very good to be my best friend over the last few years. And so I was like, I'm not sure that you want me to tell you that you are my best friend. Jesus makes this statement, and obviously he's talking about what he's getting ready to do. Greater love has no man than to lay down his life for his friends. And Jesus is going to do that and lay down his life. So there's no question that Jesus is making that statement about himself. But somehow I think that he might have been challenging the disciples at the same time. What kind of love will you show? I know I said this a week or two ago, but I bring it out again. What are the two great commandments? Jesus said this is the two great commandments. That you love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And that you love your neighbor as yourself. One of the lawyers then, one of the scribes tried to bring out, well, who is my neighbor? Is my neighbor just the people that are friends with me? Or is my neighbor someone else? And Jesus laid this out. That's where the story of the Good Samaritan comes. The Jews didn't like the Samaritans. The Samaritans didn't like the Jews. Samaritans were half-breed Jews. And so they just were not accepted by the Jews at all. And Jesus uses the Samaritan to come along and care for the Jewish man that has been robbed and beaten. And he takes care of all of his needs. And then Jesus says, who was the one that was the neighbor? Well, the Samaritan. So see, being a neighbor, that we love our neighbors, because in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus brings out the point that you need to not just love those that love you, you need to love your enemies. Now that takes something spiritual. We did that in a church years ago that I was in. I was running through these things about love, and it had not been very long since September 11th, 2001 had happened. And we were running through all these things that we should love. And I said, okay, so you're supposed to love bin Laden. I lost his name there in my mind there. Osama bin Laden, you're supposed to love him as your enemy. Boy, you talk about shutting down the excitement of love. But God teaches us that we are to love everybody, regardless of who they are, regardless of what they have done. We are still to love them. And we are absolutely to love God with everything inside of us. So, what kind of love do you have? Do you show that love? There are three words in the Greek language that is interpreted exactly the same thing, love. It is eros, phileo, and agape. All three of them are interpreted love, but they are absolutely different from one another. So if you say, I love you, you use any of those three words, it means a totally different thing from each other than what the others mean. Eros is obviously the physical love, the sensual love. Phileo is the brotherly love, the love that we give to one another, usually with strings attached to it. If you take care of me, I will take care of you. Agape is the love that goes beyond any of that and says, I love you regardless of whether you love me back or not. And I will show you that love, and I'm going to get to something about that in just a second here. So what kind of love do you show in your life? What kind of love do you show to your loved ones? What kind of love do you show to your church? What kind of love do you show to your God? It becomes a challenge, and suddenly, and I'm sorry that I do that all the time. That's just my personality and my character. I'm sorry that I take something that's supposed to be so simple and turn it into something that seems so complicated, but it really isn't that complicated. But suddenly just going out and buying a card and a box of candy doesn't seem like quite so much, does it? It kind of changes that attitude of saying, wow, I'm supposed to actually love them? So let's take a little bit of a look and looking at 1 Corinthians 13, which is known as the love chapter. And I'm just going to brush over the things that it says. It's interesting that in 1 Corinthians 13 in the King James Version, if you haven't figured out, that's what I use as the King James Version. But it always kind of made me a little bit confused because when you read that in the King James Version, it used the term charity. Well, that is interpreted off of agape. And we know that agape is love. So Paul is talking about love, but the King James writers wrote charity. The reality is that even as Jesus is using this term back in John of agape, the Israelite children didn't really have a word to try to explain agape. Because agape is such a massive thing to think about, the love that is talked about there. So I always wondered, why did the King James writers use charity instead of love? So I went to someone that was smarter than me. That's a good thing to do when you have a question, is to go to someone that is smarter than you and ask them the question of what that means. The reason that they use charity as it is known is because when someone, if someone comes to you and says, can I borrow $20 off of you? And you say, sure, when can you pay it back? Sometimes you even may want interest off of that $20. But when someone comes to you and says, I can't ever repay you that $20, but would you please help me with this? And you give that to them. You give that to them in charity with no expectation at all that they will ever be able to give it back to you. So what is being said is that I will give the love with no expectation that you will ever love me back. And again, that takes something spiritual to do that, because that's not within our nature to have that kind of love. Let's look at some of the things that it says in 1 Corinthians 13. If I speak mighty words and I don't have love, it is wasted speech. It means nothing. If I am one of the smartest and most insightful people that you know in the entire world, and I have faith to move mountains out of my way, and I don't have love, I am nothing. Does it kind of put it into perspective? What do we watch on TV with preachers putting on these big shows for us? We look for the big shows. We want somebody that is dynamic and can put on all these things. And the Bible is saying if you can do all of that and you can answer every question, you know the answer to every question, and you don't have love, you are nothing. You are nothing. Though I give all that I have to the poor, and I let my body be burned, it is a waste of time if I don't have love. So what kind of love is Paul talking about when he says this? Is he talking about the kind of love, well, if you forget to give me a box of candy on Valentine's Day, then I don't love you very much. No, he really puts this in line. Love suffers long. Love is kind. Love does not envy. Love does not puff itself up. Love doesn't promote itself. Love doesn't behave itself unseemly. Let me stop there for a second. I know we're all, well, you guys aren't very old. You guys are kind of, I'm old in this. I used to say this to young ladies when I was the youth pastor. If that guy is telling you, if you love me, you will, spit in his face and get out of the car and go home. Because love doesn't act that way. Love doesn't act that way. And if that's what someone is up to, they don't love you. Okay, now I'll move on. It doesn't have self-interest. It thinks no evil. It isn't easily provoked. It rejoices in truth and not iniquity. It believes all things. It hopes all things. It endures all things. Love never fails. Now, I'm not going to take the time. 1 Corinthians 13 goes on in verses 8 to 13 to put out some explanation about things. And that is way deep theologically. I just hope that you will read it at home. Just read 1 Corinthians 13. Read it through all the way and ask yourself this question. Do you have that kind of love in you? Do you even have that kind of love in you for God? I was dealing with someone this week, and I'm not going to go into any details, so if they're watching, they can not worry about that. But they had an issue with accepting God because of things that had happened in their lives. So, do you have that kind of love even for God? I've dealt numerous times, this has happened in my ministry with young ladies that have been just terribly abused. And they ask me the question, how could God let that happen? I remember a young man that I preached on forgiveness that Sunday morning in revival services, and he came up to me and he said, a guy did terrible things to my two-month-old daughter and then murdered her. How am I supposed to forgive him? That's big time stuff that we're talking about. So we can just flippantly say, well, yes, 1 Corinthians 13 says this. No, that is a challenge in our hearts to love the unlovable. But if we are to bring the message of Jesus Christ to the world, I'm not talking about this phony, mushy stuff that a lot of preachers are using from behind the pulpit these days. Oh, God loves you so much. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a dynamic love that God has for us. We should have for Him, or we're not abiding by those two great commandments. I love the story, and that was really the theme, and we're going to get out way early, I'm telling you, without Sunday school class, because my message was not super long in that. But I love the story about Jacob. Jacob was serving 7 years. He agreed to 7 years in order to get Rachel as his wife. He loved Rachel. And he agreed to serve her father 7 years so that he could get her. And in Genesis chapter 29, verse 20, it says, "And Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days, for the love he had for her." Jacob was a jerk. He was really a jerk. He really was. And if you got my writings in recent days, I talked some about who Jacob was and the kind of person that he was. And his name meant heel grabber because he was grabbing a hold of his twin brother's heel, trying to make sure that Esau didn't get out before he did. Jacob just had the personality, but his love was genuine. He got tricked after those 7 years that seemed like it was just a few days because they set him up with the older sister Leah. And he didn't realize until in the morning that he had Leah instead of Rachel. And so the father said, "Serve me another 7 years and I will give you Rachel." So he ended up serving 14 years to be married to Rachel. I think in that story, would I have been willing to serve 14 years? Would you be willing to serve 14 years? I used to have this recurring dream, and they used to know me as marrying Mike. That wasn't a complimentary term. I did tons of marriages. I did tons of them, and I'm not going to go into detail why, but I had people coming to me from all over the place that had nothing to do with my church whatsoever, and they would come and want me to marry them. I had a terrible dream numerous times that I had done something wrong and didn't know it, and all the people that I had married weren't actually legally married. That dream came to me. I did everything I was supposed to. All of them were legally married. But I had this dream, and it happened numerous times, and I kept thinking, oh, that would be so terrible to have to go to all of these people and say to them, you've been living together in marriage all these years and you weren't legally married. Wouldn't that be a terrible thing to have to do? But the thought went through my mind, what if you had been married for a long time and then you found out that you weren't really married? Would you go back and marry that same person over again? After 14 years of work, would you put in 14 years for them now? Would they be worth doing that for? I think if you had to actually work 14 years before you could get married, we would have a whole lot less marriages in our society than what we do. I think a lot of people would say, yeah, I don't think they're quite worth 14 years. I don't know. And a lot of weddings were really sloppy. There was a couple of times that I wanted to just stop in the middle of the ceremony and look at the couple and say, are you really sure that you want to do this? People with attitudes like, well, just get us through it. I used to tell them, well, legally, I only have to say one line. Is that what you want to do? Have all these people come up in front of me, and I will say to you, by the powers given to me by the church and the state of whatever, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Dad always told me you can't say that at the rehearsal because they're legally married at that point if you make that statement. So you cannot say that to them. But that's all you really have to say. Is that all that your marriage matters to you? Is that all that your relationship matters to you? Just get it done as fast as you can. I think that spills over because we are to be the bride of Christ. What kind of bride do we present to Him? So what are you willing to give up for those that you say that you love? Then the question comes, what would you be willing to give up for the church that you say that you love? And then ultimately, what would you be willing to give up for God that you say that you love? What is the priority of your life? I asked the question sometime in the writing. I asked the question, how many times have you missed church? I'm preaching the choir. You guys are in church. So I'm not beating up on you. You're the ones that are here. But how many times did you miss church for something that you would have never missed work for? See, it's the priority. Do we put a priority on going to church? Not in today's society. We don't. Even people that profess themselves to be Christians, going to church is way down on the totem pole. Can you be saved without church? Absolutely. I just had that discussion this week with a guy up at the restaurant. Absolutely, you can be saved without going to church. But if you want to follow a God that you don't want to spend any time with, what kind of relationship do you have? So it bothers me. I was just as guilty as everybody else. I would be ready to go out on the road sometimes for a month. I would be out on the road doing services. And we had gotten used to the routine enough that Teresa was in a wheelchair and she would roll out in the wheelchair to the back door as I was finishing loading the last things into the vehicle. And I would come back in and give her a quick kiss and she would say, "I love you." And I would say, "I love you too." And how often does "I love you too" really mean anything? Do we just say that? So when we say to God, "I love you, God," do we mean that? If you was to buy a Valentine for God, would He recognize who you were when you gave it to Him? Remember in school, you guys will have an easier time remembering in school than what I do. I admit that. But I didn't get very many Valentines in school because I just wasn't a popular guy and I wasn't outgoing and I just didn't really. Some of those people are my friends now on Facebook that I barely even knew who they were when I was in school. People go along in school and everybody's supposed to give everybody a Valentine, and you look at those Valentines and it's like, who in the world is that? I don't even know who that person is. So that's my thought to close. If you were to give God a Valentine, do you have a relationship with Him that He would know who you are? Or would He say those terrible words that the Scripture says He will say to those ones that He doesn't know? "Depart from me. I never knew you." "But Lord, we did this. We did this. We did this. All in your name." "I don't know who you are." I've made lots of mistakes, guys. Have you? Anybody in here made mistakes following God? I'm not trying to say that we don't make mistakes. But one thing that is such a huge priority to me is to make sure that that relationship is genuine between he and I. So I don't want to just once a year give him a Valentine. I want to give him a Valentine on a regular basis. He doesn't care about cards or anything like that. He cares about you. He wants you. That's what he wants. So I encourage you, if you haven't given yourself to him, do that and do it quickly.